Well, thanks very much for the opportunity to speak to you this evening. It's always really hard following a really interesting talk, isn't it? And so that's a tough act to follow. And I think I'm demonstrating as well, because you had really modern, up-to-date slides, that you don't need Doctor Who to take you back in time, because my slides are right from the 1970s. But nevertheless, hopefully I've got something interesting to say. So, in the words of Monty Python, and now for something rather different. So I'm a psychologist, and I usually start talks like this with a couple of reasons to stay awake. So here we go. So a couple of problems. One is, how can a light bulb that looks like this kill quite a lot of people? That's a mystery that I will try to explain to you a little later on. But the other mystery is, I guess, what am I doing talking to you? Because I'm particularly known for my research in the field of prejudice. So what is a psychologist who's an expert on prejudice talking to you guys, what's he doing talking to you guys about cyber security? In fact, it's also a mystery that I hope to unravel. And I guess what I'm looking at in many ways is following on from what Hanny's team would do. I guess perhaps part of what you do in your purple teaming, but it's kind of what happens next, really. And what are the pitfalls in terms of the organisation and using psychology when we try to actually learn from some of the red team exercises? Especially interested to hear Hanny talk about how often the initial way in is by kind of hacking the human. So that, I think, fits quite neatly into some of these issues. So I'll try and touch on as many of these as I can today. Including, is it ethical to blame an employee successfully targeted by a red team if the exploited flaw is kind of a general human tendency, which is very often the case? I also want to ask a question about how can mitigations deployed in response to red team attacks sometimes make the situation worse? And I'm going to give you some examples of how that could happen. Is it wise to view a successfully hacked employee as a lone actor? My experience is often that although you might get your initial way in via hacking a particular employee, the actions that they engage in to allow the red teamers in, probably you're going to see in other parts of the business as well. Is it safe to assume that a knowledge deficit lies behind the social engineering vulnerability? It's often assumed that knowledge deficits lie behind risky behaviour. But is it safe to assume that? And how can we deploy the psychology of group dynamics to shed light on the impacts of red team activities? So I want to give an example of a possible social engineering attack, and Hanny talked about one vector to try and get into the company being through phishing. So this phishing email popped into my inbox a few years ago, and I often talk about this to various audiences because I think it's pretty well constructed. One claims to be from the TV licensing organisation in the United Kingdom. It was received on a Monday. That in itself is a useful social engineering ploy, because I don't know how you feel about Monday mornings, but it's not my favourite time of the week. And when you first open your email inbox and you're confronted by hundreds of emails, then it's a pretty depressing time. And can you honestly say you deploy your full attention to all of those emails first thing on a Monday morning? Potentially not. It doesn't fit many typical phishing email heuristics. These are the stereotypical assumptions that people tend to hold about what a phishing email looks like. It doesn't particularly have clear English. The font, the layout, colour scheme is correct for the TV licensing organisation. There is some account information there, and how many of you know your TV license number, so you can't immediately know that that account information is incorrect. But on this occasion, hovering over the link didn't really give anything away that this was nebulous. When you take a deeper dive into it, you see some social engineering going on. So it starts off immediately by grabbing your attention and causing anxiety, by saying something's gone wrong, not what you want to hear first thing on Monday morning. It starts to build a sense of urgency by talking to you about something expiring. So it's pushing you to action by saying that something's gone wrong, something's expiring, building up to presenting a kind of threat. Basically, if you don't do something, something bad is going to happen. The bad thing that's going to happen is that debt collection agencies could be involved. Again, not something you want to be thinking about on a Monday morning. So threat, fear-inducing, and time pressure is building up here because you've got 2 days to act. So quite a lot of common social engineering ploys, but in quite a nice package actually. In terms of phishing emails, pretty good one because it's got some quite sound psychology behind the social engineering of it. It finishes with a nice little behavioural nudge as well. Payment's easy. We like easy. You just have to click there and the problem will go away. So why do we focus on these issues when we see a phishing email like this and not some of the clear giveaways that all is not right with this email? Let me give you another example which explains how a light bulb can nearly all the passengers on a civil airliner. So, 1972, a wide-body jet is flying over Florida in dark nighttime conditions. It's quite stormy outside. They're having a problem on the flight deck with a light bulb that is associated with the landing gear. And this is really annoying the 3 crew members on the flight deck because they can't tell whether it's giving them a correct indication or not. So they're playing around with this light bulb, figuring out whether they can change it on the flight deck. The pilot does something fairly innocuous and leans forward as he tries to access the light bulb. Unfortunately, he pushes against the control column and disconnects the autopilot. Because the 3 crew are talking quite loudly about the problem, they don't hear the alarm sound that indicates the autopilot is disconnected. The plane begins to descend, and before they realise what's happening, the plane crashes into the Florida Everglades. So, in that way, a light bulb can cause an airliner to crash. What happened, the same kind of inattentional blindness, where here you've got people who are trained to try and look at certain bits of data in their visual field, but because something unexpected happens, it grabs their attention and they don't pay attention to the really important data, such as the altimeter winding down and down and down. Just not a great sign. So, inattentional blindness means we don't notice things like the fact that the years don't match. We don't notice the fact that there's this weird section at the bottom right of this email that says, yes, claims bonus. So they're trying to link this to the language of insurance, where you talk about a no claims bonus, but a yes claims bonus doesn't make any sense, and insurance doesn't make any sense in the context of a TV license anyway. But most people looking at this don't process those bits of information because of inattentional blindness. The question is, if this is a way in for a red teamer, can you really blame the individual who made that fateful click? Because inattentional blindness is a basic human tendency. The powerful social engineering vectors that are part of this email, we can all fall prey to in one way or another. And that's an interesting ethical question. The knee-jerk reaction is enforced completion of a training module. So when an organisation identifies that an individual clicked through, and this could be in response to red team activity, it could be a phishing simulation that's been deployed, that's often the knee-jerk reaction. Okay, sorry, you clicked through on this, we'd like you to do your online training module again. What that does though, is it doesn't really peel back the layers and ask the question, well, why did the click happen in the first place? Was it due to knowledge deficit? Was it motivational in nature? Was there some kind of workload related issue? It's fighting the fire without really knowing why it started in the first place. And this is something I see time and time again in organisations, a lack of willingness to really go further and ask the question, why is this happening? How widespread is it? One of the things we need to bear in mind is the fragility of what we call the psychological work contract. That's this contract between the employee and employer. It's to do with things like work satisfaction, a sense of organisational commitment and identity. In my own area, higher education, it's particularly fragile at the moment because we are in the midst of industrial action, as are many other public sector organisations. So is it a great time to do red teaming in the public sector, to deploy phishing simulations and this sort of thing? Arguably, potentially not. Another thing to bear in mind is that the evidence for sanctions is actually really not there. Sanctions don't seem to be very predictive of behaviour. So another knee-jerk reaction would be to sanction employees who click through, but actually the evidence is that it's not very effective. One of the ways in which the psychological work contract is threatened is when you get a victim mentality. So recently we've been running focus group research on the campus, and one of the questions we've been asking is, how would you feel if you heard that a colleague clicked on a link? And we get answers like this, or sorry for them, they must feel awful, it could happen to anybody after all. And this is rather like the perception we have of, let's say we heard a work colleague was burgled. Your first reaction wouldn't be, did you not invest in good locks? Your first reaction will tend to be, oh wow, that's horrible to have that happen to you. And when people's first reaction is to have a victim mentality, to then have the organisation blame them and potentially levy sanctions is threatening that fragile work contracts. You combine that with a perception that responsibility shouldn't lie solely with the employees. So here someone is telling us, I appreciate I don't want to be clicking phishing emails. I have a degree of responsibility, but also I don't think it should all rest on me. And that's quite a common perception as well. That yes, sure, I hold some responsibility, but the organisation should be protecting me as well. And so when you have that perception that the organisation should have the kind of benevolent function of protecting its workforce, when you then come down hard on employees that make mistakes and click through on things like phishing emails, it's unexpected because the organisation is supposed to be the benevolent protector. So it's potentially problematic when you link that to the perception of fatalism and not much personal blame being accepted. It's a numbers game, it's going to get one of us eventually. Then you get people not stepping up and taking responsibility. Now, how can attempts to improve the situation, perhaps following red team activity, actually make things worse? Well, one of the issues is the spray and pray response, which I see quite a lot, and any fans of sci-fi will recognise the M134 minigun, being a bit nerdy here, that can spew out 6,000 rounds per minute. The M134 minigun is a kind of shock and awe weapon. Actually, it's not all that effective against particular targets, but what it does is scare the crap out of everyone in the immediate vicinity. I often see organisations trying to scare the crap out of everyone in the organisation in response to, let's say, phishing simulations that haven't gone that well and have highlighted a lot of click-throughs. There's a problem with the spray-pray effect. What I often see is very keen comms teams, very keen behaviour change units, saying to the organisation, sure, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this, let's do it all, in response to a problem that's been identified. So we run a comms campaign. We simultaneously buy a new training module. We simultaneously think about, could we incentivise, could we gamify? We may even do something technical and start requiring people to change their passwords every few weeks and have some other new technical cybersecurity requirement. Imagine though that you went to your doctor because you have a rash that you can't explain, you don't know why it's happened. And your doctor said, okay, well, you know what? I don't think we need to run any tests on you. I'm going to give you 4 or 5 different meds. and one of them is probably going to work. Well, if it did work and it cured the rash, that's good in one sense. However, you've got no idea which medication worked. So moving forwards, you've kind of really got no idea why you got the rash in the first place. And that's the risk when an organisation responds in this way. It's great that the comms team's really keen to do something for cyber. It's great that a behaviour change team might try and do something. But if everyone tries to do something at once, it's actually not a very good scientific experiment. It doesn't give you that insight into what works and what doesn't work. There's definitely a problem when you take an engineering point of view and you try and engineer a solution. One of the biggest problems we see is in aviation, where there's a tendency to try to design out human error. Give the example, the McDonnell Douglas company, when they created the MD-82 airliner, recognised that there was a problem where sometimes the aircrew would forget to correctly configure the aircraft before taking off. So they came up with an engineering solution to that human problem, which was to create a very, very annoying alarm that would sound all of the time they were taxiing out to the runway if they hadn't configured the aircraft. The problem was pilots only really like to configure the aircraft when they're at the runway threshold. Now, at some airports, it can take up to half an hour to taxi out from the gate to the runway threshold. Take Amsterdam Schiphol, for example. Some of the runways are very far away from the terminals. So these MD-82 pilots would be hearing a really annoying alarm for up to half an hour. Well, like every good human being, they try to find a novel solution to a problem. And their novel solution was to turn behind them and pull the circuit breaker to that alarm system, deactivating it. So unwittingly, the engineers had caused a problem by trying to solve one. And unfortunately, on one fateful day, it appeared that an airliner crashed onto a nearby highway because they actually did forget to correctly configure the airliner for takeoff, but they deactivated the alarm system because it was so annoying to hear. So that sort of engineering approach we also see in response to red team attacks and other vulnerabilities that are exposed. Let me give you an example. So a red team exercise identifies and exploits a vulnerability linked to employees sending sensitive data to third-party organisations using unauthorised personal file sharing accounts, personal Dropbox accounts, personal email and other ways of sharing sensitive data that the company doesn't want them sharing in this kind of uncontrolled way. The solution that was rolled out was a technical one. Let's block all of these websites and file sharing websites so that literally people just can't do that. So that's a pretty obvious step to take, but if you fail to start to peel away the layers of the onion and ask the question, why were people doing that? You run the risk of this solution doing what that alarm system did, which is solving one problem but creating another. And that's exactly what happened. The unanticipated response, because that in-house file system was so clunky and time-consuming to get people set up on, was that employees started downloading this sensitive data to USB or burning DVDs and popping them in jiffy bags and sending them in post. So that was even worse. So the technical solution had actually created an even worse behaviour than the one it was designed to solve. And it could have been avoided if more investigative behavioural work had been undertaken first, and people had asked that question, why on earth are people doing it? And basically, a simple cost-benefit analysis was being conducted by those employees, and they were deciding that the cost was too high of the new system for a relatively low benefit, whereas the benefit of burning a DVD and sending that in a jiffy bag was high and the cost was low. And these cost-benefit analyses are conducted by employees all the time and gives us insight into why some employees don't follow through in behaviours. Here's another example. So a red team exercise identifies and exploits an issue where senior managers are seen to regularly sign off new access requests without checking them thoroughly. And as a consequence, a red teamer gets access to a system and can take it down. Now, the easiest organisational response is to maybe discipline the senior manager or send out comms saying, please take access requests more seriously, they're really important. But is it wise to view a successfully hacked employee in this kind of circumstance as a lone actor? Should we be disciplining the senior manager without thinking things through a bit more? The knee-jerk reaction might be to think, well, okay, this is one bad apple in the organisation. Somebody being lazy, reckless, careless, maybe they're even malevolent and trying to harm the business. And in the West, we have a natural tendency to believe that bad behaviours tend to be caused by factors that are something to do with the makeup of individuals. We tend to be a bit blind to the fact that sometimes bad behaviours happen for more group psychology reasons. Now we could think, and you see this in how people talk about prejudice as well, if only you could get to know the other person, people from that background, then we could all live in peace and harmony in a hippie-like commune. So if only we could educate people. And I hear the same thing when we look at how businesses respond to cyber. Oh, we need more education. We need another comms campaign. We need people to do the training module again. But there's this assumption that risky behaviour that could have been exploited by red teamers is somehow due to a knowledge deficit. My own research in a range of multinational organisations and my own institution, research which we're doing right now, suggests actually that there's evidence for what some researchers call peak awareness having been achieved. When I get down and dirty, so to speak, and talk using interviews and focus groups to end users, they know what phishing is. They know what makes a strong password. They know about many of the risks, many of the things red teamers might exploit to some degree, not at a technical level, but they know what's safe practice and what's unsafe practice. So there isn't that knowledge gap. It is pretty similar to another field that I work in, which is health education and behaviour change in the health sphere. I mean, it's no good telling a smoker that, by the way, did you know smoking gives you cancer? So they already know that. So there is no point promoting those sorts of messages if you want to stop people smoking. It's ineffective. What we do know from the research is that perceptions of coping and self-efficacy are about the only behavioural factors that have a body of research behind them. When we're asking people to do something, they need to feel it's within their ability to do it, and it's not going to interfere with their everyday work practices. It's not going to interfere with their productivity. Those are the only factors which are scientific evidence behind them. The ideal is adherence, which is people buying actively into the idea of keeping the organisation safe. But too often, what people go for is compliance, which is a much more passive kind of idea. It's following the rules without really believing that they're important. Research shows ultimately that how employees feel towards the business is at least as important a driver of adherence as awareness. So that comes back to that psychological work contract. And the problem is that when you follow up risky employee behaviour, you risk breaking that relationship. So you risk souring how your employees feel towards the organisation. When you've got employees who feel underappreciated, who feel no sense of identity with the business, then it's really, really difficult to get them on board with staying safe. So, conclusions. Preparing for this talk, I looked at a lot of what I would call propaganda from businesses that do red teaming. Don't think I looked at yours, but a lot of claims are made. So red teaming, its claims, can raise awareness. It might do, but as I said, I've made a case that we're already at a point of peak awareness anyway. To be honest, employees know what a lot of the risks are. So I'm not sure I buy into that. Does it improve accountability? Well, I've given you a few reasons why it might not. For example, there is a victim perception. There is a perception that the company should be protecting individuals. So it won't necessarily increase accountability. Does it enhance communication within the organisation? This is a claim made by some companies that will come and do red teaming for you. Well, that depends on the group dynamics that are in play. It can certainly make things a lot worse. When you've got an organisation with a lot of disgruntled employees, if they then find out that they've been employing a red team to try and catch them out, it's unlikely to enhance the relationships between senior management and the rest of the business. It's unlikely to make relations between the IT function and the rest of the business more positive. So I don't think you can always claim that you're going to enhance communication within the organisation either. What's crucial is that the follow-up to what Hanny's talking about, the follow-up to the red team activities, is based on sound behavioural research within the organisation. So you know why these vulnerabilities are there. And absolutely, the wrong response can threaten that fragile employer-employee relationship and unwittingly create new problems, as those engineers in aviation did. So those are my conclusions. I hope not too controversial. And if you'd like to come and visit us as a wonderful campus, as you can see there, do come along, get in touch. I'd like to talk more about the behavioural work that we do. But thank you for the opportunity to talk to you all this evening.